Hi everybody, thank you for coming out on such a beautiful afternoon. This of course is our fantasy of what happens with One Book, One Salem, that so many people from the community will show up when we have the author here in person, so thank you so much for making my dreams come true. I'm Joyce Maroney. I am the president of the Board of Trustees of the Salem Athenaeum. The Salem Athenaeum is the producer of the Salem Literary Festival. This is the last session of our 15th annual Lit Fest. This Lit Fest is brought to you by a group of volunteers. And as anyone sitting in the room knows, you did not pay an admission fee to be here. We do try to bring all of our offerings with the festival each year to you at no cost. That doesn't mean we don't bear a cost for mounting the Literary Festival. So on your way out, there are lovely, elegant QR codes and a bucket where you can drop some offerings if you feel so moved. It's my pleasure to introduce our next introducer is Representative Manny Cruz, who represents Salem, the 7th Essex District. Manny is a son of Salem, a lover of literature. He helped us kick off our very first One Book, One Salem program last year. And so we have invited him back to talk a little bit about his reactions to this book and to introduce today's speakers. So no further ado, Representative Cruz.
Good afternoon. I'm going to try that again. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Much better. Thank you for filling my cup. It is a tremendous pleasure to be able to be here again this year to introduce our author. And I first and foremost want to thank you, Joyce, and the board members at the Salem Athenaeum for putting on One Book, One Salem, as this is an incredible event. Last year, I had such a fantastic time being able to read something other than a children's book over the summer. Proud parent of a 1 and a 3-year-old, and so this book was a particular treat. In all seriousness, I know that there's some folks here that are familiar faces. I want to thank the members of the public that are here today, keeping literacy alive, and for being on your lifelong journey of learning. And as Joyce mentioned in her introduction, I am a lover of literacy, whether it's for my own children or for myself. I'm a writer and a storyteller, and that love of learning really did stem from some of the first books that I read as a kid. But in particular, I always remembered my affinity towards real historical accounts, especially those that relate to our history. I think one of the things that I'd be remiss if I didn't acknowledge as our state representative and the vice chair of the Salem School Committee is that the thing that keeps me up at night is the fact that there are attacks on our living history happening all throughout this country. And what I think disturbs me the most is that people want to engage in erasure. I have the distinct pleasure of serving as Salem's first Afro-Indigenous state representative. And when I think about the history of my people who were both native to the Caribbean and my African ancestors who were enslaved, and the harrowing experiences that they had, the thought that any public leader would stand up and try to erase that history because they were scared of the pain and weren't thinking about the restoration that it could bring to our country, that bothers me. And that is why I'm so grateful to be able to be here today to talk about a book that, as I got about halfway through, really resonated with me. And it resonated with me because of my ancestors. As I think about my ancestors who were enslaved, both my Taino ancestors and my African ancestors, I have to think about their resilience. I'm their wildest dreams. The fact that I can stand before you as someone who now writes laws when people who held seats like mine wrote the very laws that put them into slavery. I think that speaks to the majesty of those who were enslaved and the aspirations that they had for their descendants. And every single day, as I make my way to the State House to represent this great city, the city of Salem, I pass by what is known as the African Meeting House, now the Museum of African American History. And this historic site was once a sanctuary, and it still is. It is a place of resistance and a beacon of hope for freedom seekers, abolitionists, and those who were fighting the fight for justice and abolition. And when I walked by that meeting house, I had the pleasure of going inside for New England's first Black Legislator Summit, and to know the history of who came to that meeting house. Frederick Douglass and abolitionists from all around the Commonwealth and from New England. And as I read this book, I couldn't help but think that the Crafts also must have made their way to that meeting house to not only share their account, their daring escape from Macon, Georgia, but also to do the work that was still necessary to ensure that their loved ones who were still enslaved could someday still be free. And I think as I read this book, this story beautifully captures a love story, a daring escape, and it really brought it to life. And I connected with it, and it made me think about my ancestors and what they went through. And so for that, I'm eternally grateful to you, Ilyon, for taking the time to write this story with accuracy, with fidelity, and going to those primary sources, and ensuring that this was done with care and with the dignity of the crafts in mind. So all of us have had an opportunity to read this book, and in particular, I could feel my heart beating out my chest at different points. And I was imagining the Crafts near Beacon Hill, within a rifle shot away from the folks who were hunting them down. And they came to Boston looking for them, and it was their allies who stood up and made sure that they could delay those fugitive slave hunters. And I feel like that is the spirit of our Commonwealth, that we were a place that certainly has its history with racism and slavery, but also a history of abolition. And I think when I read this book and I reflect on it and where we're at today as a city in Salem, where we talk about doing the work of allyship and addressing systemic racism, this conversation about this particular book couldn't be more important. So with that, I'm so excited to be able to welcome you to my beloved city to discuss the content, to answer our questions, and to bring it to life for everyone in the audience today. So I have the distinct pleasure of being able to introduce Ilyon Woo, who is the Pulitzer-Prize winning author of Master Slave, Husband, Wife, An Epic Journey from Slavery to Freedom. It was an instant New York Times bestseller, one of the New York Times' 10 best books of 2023, a People magazine top 10 book of the year, and a finalist for the Kirkus Prize. It was also named as the best book of the year by the New Yorker, Time Magazine, NPR, the Smithsonian Magazine, Boston and Chicago Public Libraries, and Oprah Daily. Ilyon is a previous author of The Great Divorce, which, as I understand, we have copies of outside. And so when you finish this book, if you haven't already, make sure to pick that one up, because I'm looking forward to reading it. But The Great Divorce, a 19th century mother's extraordinary fight against her husband, the Shakers, and her times. So again, add that one to your reading list. Her writing has appeared in the Boston Globe, the Wall Street Journal, and the New York Times. And she's received the support for her research from the Whiting Foundation and the National Endowment for Humanities. She holds a BA from Yale College and a PhD in English from Columbia University. Let's all give her a warm welcome. Now that is a warm Salem welcome indeed. One could say it was magical. And I think that the second part that I get to do today that I didn't get to do last year is I get to introduce two people today, which is fantastic. So Ilyon is joined today by Dr. Elizabeth Herbin Triant, an associate professor of Black Studies and History at Amherst College, and she was a 2023 fellow at the Harvard Radcliffe Institute and is also an author. And I believe we also have your book out front as well. And she is the author of Threatening Property, Race, Class, and Campaigns to Legislate Jim Crow Neighborhoods 2019. She's currently at work on a book about Lowell, Massachusetts and its relationship to slavery. And I can't wait to hear more about that. So without further ado, let's give Dr. Betsy Herbin Triant also a warm welcome.
thank you so much to everyone for joining us today to talk about an excellent, excellent book. So it was a real pleasure to read this and an honor to join you today, Ilyon, to talk about it. So you are a really gifted storyteller, and I definitely want to talk about craft, how you wrote this book. But I guess we should start out by talking about the story itself. So if you can just tell us about this epic journey that William and Ellen Craft took, and then about their lives in freedom for anyone who hasn't had a chance yet to read it.
Sure. So first, thank you. I'm so excited to be here in conversation with you, Betsy. And thank you all for being here on this beautiful day, for joining us here in conversation about the book. I'm really happy to be here in Salem. My first memory of Salem was actually a little creepier than the vibe I'm getting now. I still have, I think I was a child with an overactive imagination, which has proved helpful in the long run, but not so good when you're trying to get to sleep. And I was speaking about this earlier with Mr. Cruz too, but I still can hear the voice of Giles Corey in that wax museum saying, "More wait." So I'm happy to be making new Salem memories here with you, with William and Ellen Craft, who came through here. And when you think about them coming through here in the spring of 1849, which was a very dangerous time in this country for people like them, and particularly for them, they came here to Salem because it's a place where people were going to be receptive to hearing their story and where they could change minds. So the places where they went to speak at that time were very carefully chosen. And I think it speaks a lot to the history of your town that the Crafts came through here. But let's rewind a little bit now back to the beginning. So for those of you who haven't read the book or are not yet familiar with the story, William and Ellen Craft were an enslaved couple who lived in Macon, Georgia. And in 1848, they embark on an extraordinary journey that when it still makes me feel like I'm at the edge of my seat when I think about what they went through and what they risked at that time. So what they do is they plan this epic journey to freedom from Macon over 1,000 miles to Philadelphia, with Ellen, who is fair-complected, posing as a rich, white, disabled man, and William posing as her slave. And they do this not by going on any kind of underground railroad, which does not reach as far down south to Georgia, even if that's something that they wanted. Okay. I'll keep my hand away from there. I'm going to ask for some good magic to keep this technology running. So they go on, this is a time of information and transportation and revolution, as well as democratic revolt around the world. And they ride the technologies of their day. They're on the steam trains and they're on the steamboats, and they are, they are flying across the country. Ellen riding in first class, highly visible, if not known, in their escape. But actually that escape to the north is just the first part of their journey. They end up becoming, in this sort of second act, they are become celebrities on the abolitionist lecture circuit, coming through places like Salem. Before then, after the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act in 1850, they are hunted. And then they must make another escape out of the country, this time out of the United States of America, to be free. So that's it in sort of a nutshell. Those are the sort of three acts, and let's go deeper.
Okay. Well, could you tell us how you came to this story?
Yeah, so we were just talking about Eric Foner, who we both had the pleasure of studying with at Columbia. And it was while I was at Columbia, not in Foner's class, but actually in a literature class taught by Robert O'Mealy in the literature department, that I first read the Crafts narrative, which they published in 1863, about a dozen years after their escape. And even though it was written, centuries ago, there's something about this voice that really speaks off the page. And I remember I was at Star East Asian Library, if you can picture that, the inside of the Star Library. And I just remember the feeling of being kind of electrified by these words and wanting to know more about these people who so compellingly told the story of love and adventure and this desire for freedom, but for whom that freedom journey wasn't entirely satisfied, and whose story still had many questions that the narrative left unanswered. So that was the beginning for me.
And so they were new to you, right? And I find that my students haven't heard of William and Ellen Craft, right? They've heard of Frederick Douglass, they've heard of Harriet Jacobs, right? But not the Crafts. And why do you think that is? So as you say, their narrative is captivating, right? But why are people not teaching this narrative or teaching their story to students?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I'd be just curious to know, a show of hands, how many people had heard of the Crafts before? Okay. A few. Had you read their narrative before, but you had heard of their story? I'm always heartened to see a few more hands every time I speak. But this is actually pretty typical, also, as with your classroom, is that the Crafts aren't the known names of, let's say, Douglass and Tubman and Sojourner Truth and others that we now know much better. The question as to why. So I have the pleasure and the honor of being of calling actually number of the descendants of William and Ellen Craft friends, and one of them, the Crafts' great-great-granddaughter, Peggy Trotter Damon Priestley, she answers the question in this way. She says that whether or not you have heard of the Crafts has everything to do with what kind of information, what kind of stories you have access to. So there are people, of course, the Crafts descendants who have been stewards of this history for as long as since as soon as the history happened. But why is it that the story was so well known in the middle of the 19th century and it's not known now? I think it has a lot to do with what we as a nation have chosen to remember, and who gets to remember what stories and tell which stories into the present day. I think the Craft story, as I just shared earlier in that summary, it has these multiple arcs to it. It's not like they get to the north and then we can celebrate. It's happily ever after, they're free, they live a good life. They keep making difficult choices, and they keep encountering the challenges to their freedom even when they are in a free part of the country. And I think what that says to us about our country and what it means to be free in America complicates a rosy pictured image that is celebratory, that is easy to remember. And I think reckoning with the full story of the Crafts forces us to reckon with a much more complex picture of America, what it has meant to be an American. But actually, I would love to throw that question back to you. You're being a professor as well. If you have any further thoughts about why the story is not better known than it is.
I mean, as to the question of assigning a narrative, if you're teaching students about slavery and want to assign a slave narrative, I mean, Frederick Douglass, his writing is so rich that it's like incomparable, right? There's no other narrative, I think, that if you have to pick one narrative, a lot of people will choose his, because he makes the case against slavery so boldly and beautifully. And then Harriet Jacobs, I think a lot of people assign her story. She was an enslaved woman who was subject to sexual abuse, harassment on the part of her enslaver. And so she hidden in an attic for 7 years and then made her escape from there. And during those 7 years, she'd be looking out the window at her children, right, before she made her escape. So I think a lot of people will assign her narrative to understand like the complexities that enslaved women face under slavery, having to do with, sexual, trying to think of the right word, given that my own kids are here, but yeah. So I think like those particular narratives are useful teaching tools. But I hope that your book will encourage people to assign, the crafts narrative too. I mean, in addition to your book, I hope that people will read the crafts words as well.
I hope so too, and it's easily accessible. You can get a digitized version of it, with a tap of your fingers on your phone. And I think actually, you're talking about Harriet Jacobs is also reminding me of this, is that, and I think we'll go deeper into Ellen Craft, but when you look at Ellen Craft's story in particular, and the generations of trauma that the lightness of her skin represents, we're looking at a story that calls into question, the horrors of slavery, but also like there's problems of class and race and gender and ability all tied together in her story. And those are difficult questions to discuss in any era, but they're ones I think that we're sort of maybe newly prepared to unpack now in ways that we haven't been ready as a nation before.
Yeah, no, your book talks about disability, right? And right now, disability studies is something that scholars are taking on. So yeah, I agree that it's a particular moment maybe when people are ready to hear this story. And especially to better understand Ellen, right? A woman who is, she does have African heritage, but she looks white, right? How do we understand the way that she thinks about herself, right? She's billed as a quote unquote white slave, but she doesn't like that phrasing because that's not how she thinks of herself as white. So yeah, I think the way that we're thinking about identity now and disability help us to understand her story. I do have another question before then, but why don't we kind of dive into talking about Ellen and about kind of what is the impact on audiences, I think, to hear the crafts tell their story, right? So they're on the abolitionist circuit, as was Frederick Douglass, as was William Wells Brown and others, right, telling the story, and they're not just, telling it, they're making the case against slavery, right? They're telling it with a purpose. And so that's impacting these northern audiences, and I wondered if we could just talk more about that. Like, what is the impact? Like, what does it mean to northerners to hear from fugitives from slavery?
Yeah, and I want to pause for a moment there, just on the mere fact of their speaking as they are, because they are really just days out of bondage when they're in Philadelphia, when they have to make this decision where they're going to go next. And their original choice was to go to Canada. And if they went to Canada, the book would stop like right about here, right? They would be in a free country, and they would have avoided a whole lot of trouble. They would have been safe. But instead, in comes in really one of actually my favorite characters, and I'd be curious to know what you all think of him. People either seem to love him or hate him. William Wells Brown. So he's this, larger than life, dazzling, charismatic man who also knew what it was to be enslaved. And he comes and he invites the crafts to go on the road and tell the story with him. I can't even underscore how, in many ways shocking these choices that they made. They are just so recently out of bondage. They are, if they're going to tell the story, they're going to be going into packed halls like this. Like you imagine an auditorium, places in Salem, other towns. They're looking out in the audience and they have no idea who's there. The lights are on them the way they're on right now. They can't see the faces of people. Anybody could be out there and anybody could be there to seize them back into bondage. And as they're advertising where they're going from place to place, people can track them, and they do across the country. They can see where they are going. So they are putting themselves most definitely in harm's way in order to tell this story. So in my enthusiasm for this, I've lost sight of the original part of the question, but that's my cause, which is just to think how incredibly brave this is. Not just for them to have made them escape, but them to then turn around and try to help all those who are left behind.
Yeah. So the question is about why it matters to audiences. What's the impact on these white northern audiences to hear from fugitives?
Yeah, and especially for Ellen Craft. So she is a pioneer right now in the lecture circuit, because when they are speaking, when they have made their flight in 1848, Sojourner Truth is really just getting started. People don't know who she is. Harriet Tubman is still in bondage herself. There's Mariah Stewart, who has spoken previously in and around here, but she's not as well known. So for Ellen Craft, who is a Southern-born woman who has had this experience of slavery, to be telling her story on the road is pretty much unprecedented. And when people see her, when white northern audiences see her, see this woman who appears white, it's a huge shock for them. And actually, again, William Wells Brown he's the drama guy, and he knows what kind of impact this is going to make. And so both for reasons of safety, because again, they don't know who's in the audience, and also for reasons of drama, the Crafts sort of stayed at the side in the beginning, and then at this dramatic moment, he says, and here they are, William and Ellen Craft, and there is a universal gasp that goes through. People take one look at her, and again, these white audience members are seeing somebody who look like, as they say, she could be her. She looks like she could be their daughter, their sister, their wives, themselves. And that brings home the horror of slavery in a way that these audience members have not experienced before, because they see themselves in her, and they see the humanity in her, and they cannot distance themselves from her.
Your book has all of these marvelous details, and one that struck me was that the audiences have to touch her, right? Like that they need to, I guess it's like how today we'll take a picture of something if we want to remember it or feel that we were close to it, but yeah, everyone wants to touch both of the Crafts, and it sounds like they're being mobbed after their talk by people who want to touch them.
Yeah. It's really kind of a laying on of hands, and I mean, again, the Crafts are just weeks or months or days out of bondage, and to have all these white hands reaching for them, I can't even imagine what that experience must have been like for them.
Yeah. Well, if you'll indulge me, I brought up quotation just to sort of throw into the mix for when we're talking about the impact on audiences of fugitives speaking like the Crafts did. So it's from an abolitionist poet and editor, John Greenleaf Whittier, who is based in Lowell. And so he's talking about fugitives who are coming through giving talks like this. And so they're coming through Lowell too, they're coming through all of these cities in the north. So he says, talking about impact, it's in this way that the terrible reality of slavery is from time to time brought home to the people of this section of the country. Occasionally a fugitive from oppression seeks shelter among us and reveals the horrors of his house of bondage. We see that the black man is, after all, our brother. We see that he has the energies, the faculties, the sympathies, the aspirations of a man. When we listen to his choking voice of sorrow as he tells us of his children torn from him and sold at public outcry into strange distant regions. When his eye flashes, as with broken, indignant words he hints at his own degradation and suffering under the whip of the driver and lays bare his scarred shoulder, we feel that here our common humanity has suffered, that a grievous wrong has been done to our common nature, that as a brother man, the slave has a claim upon our sympathies. We no longer regard slavery in the abstract, right? So that we have if you think about these northern audiences, right, they had never seen enslaved people. They probably would not have much interaction with African Americans generally, right? And slavery is really remote from them and their experience. And so to see someone firsthand and see that, they've experienced pain when they're being told, by Southerners, like that slavery is beneficial and, bringing civilization and, all good things to the enslaved, right? That I think that's why it had such an impact.
Yeah, and I was thinking about this too, which is, the idea of that abstraction. So they might read anti-slavery literature, stories, or even propaganda, and they might be moved by that. But then there's a point at which, where does that sentiment really start turning into action? And I think that's what speakers like the Crafts do, is they motivate people to go beyond sympathy into something more like empathy, into direct action. People feel like they can't distance themselves from the moral wrong, the inhumanity of what's going on. It just makes that impossible. If you think about Americans in 1848, I alluded to the worldwide revolutions. We had just also finished the Mexican-American War. People had sent their sons into war. They had seen death. They didn't want to go into another war. And they certainly did not want a civil war, which really seemed to be looming. So people might have the feeling, well, this is wrong, what's going on in the South is wrong, but we made a deal with them, and, what can we do at this point? Are we going to go to war? Are we going to put everything on the line? What if all these refugees from the South, this is another Southern argument that was made against abolition, what if there's this flood of refugees coming from the South, coming into the North, taking Northern jobs, becoming charity cases? Or how are we going to live with North and South joined in this different kind of way? There was a lot of fear. And what happened is when the Crafts came, people like the Crafts, William Wells Brown, Frederick Douglass came and told their story, and and people heard these stories and these direct testimonies of what was going on the ground in the South, in this heinous system. They could no longer make these kinds of arguments. And people became propelled into action as never before.
Yeah. Well, I wondered if you could talk a bit about how widespread anti-slavery thinking was in the North, and I guess, again, was it these speakers that are changing minds? Is it Garrison's The Liberator? What are people reading? What is sort of this milieu in which Northern minds are changing? And I guess I wanted to just sort of insert a bit, right, about how we think of the North as just this bastion of, abolitionism, but if my own research on Lowell, right, you see that the mill owners very much want their access to cotton to, be uninterrupted, right? And so they're shutting down abolitionist speakers. They're making the case in writing, right, that we have a deal with the Constitution, that Southerners are entitled to their enslaved property, and we don't have the right to stop them from doing what they wish with their property, right? So can you say more about these anti-slavery?
Yeah, what was astonishing to me as I was doing this research is the degree to which people were actually opposed to abolition. So we do love to think about these, these Underground Railroad stories and all these people who resisted. And yes, there were tons of people who came to talks that people like the Crafts and Douglass were making, but many of these were extremely hostile, which is again why William Wells Brown, who was coordinating all these, essentially the circuit tour, had to be so careful. So the Crafts came to New England. They did their tour in the spring of 1849. 6 months before, William Wells Brown had been on a stage in Harwich in Cape Cod in Massachusetts, and there had been an anti-slavery mob that had attacked him and Lucy Stone and another speaker, and he'd been thrown off the stage. There were, Douglas and Garrison had gone together on the speaking tour in Pennsylvania, and they also had gotten mobbed and attacked. I mean, these could be really violent experiences in the North, right? Not far from where we are, where people are coming to speak. Abolition was not the dominant point of view.
Thank you. Let's see. Can you speak a bit about Salem and to what extent Salem fits into your story? I wonder, about the Black community in Salem, and how much, whether it's local Black abolitionists inviting the crafts to speak here, if they spoke here.
Yeah. So actually, I was looking into Salem again and kind of marveling at how many amazing activists were connected to Salem or were born and raised in Salem. There was a strong Black activist community. Again, that's why I think the crafts felt safe enough to come here and to speak here, why they were welcomed. The Remonds are a famous family. So Charles Lennox Remond, who was an abolitionist speaker, his sister Sarah Parker Remond, she started lecturing. She gave her first anti-slavery testimony when she was 16 years old. And she ends up lecturing not only here, but abroad in England. And later on, she stays with the crafts, and she's speaking all over there. You can actually see her picture. All right. So a number of these people, if you open the book, the hardcover has it as the end papers, but I actually convinced the publisher to reproduce the same set of images in the paperback edition of the book as well. But I wanted the first thing for readers to see, and I would have actually loved to see it on the cover, but we had a little bit of a disagreement about the cover. But you do see when you open the book, I mean, you can kind of you undress the book, you lose this color, and you see this black and white book, and you see all these people. So the crafts were heroes, and they were amazing, and a lot of these stories that we celebrate seem to celebrate these heroes on their journey. But they made the lives that they were able to make, and they were able to stand up the way they stood up with allies. And so this is what you might call their sort of army of allies. And a number of these have connections to Salem. So this beautiful woman on the far right of the page is Sarah Parker Remond, and she's from here. And actually, there are so many research leads in here that I've left. I mean, people who read the Kindle edition are like, oh, the book was not as long as I thought. But it turns out there are a ton of notes. And yes, there are. And that's because, again, each one of these people could, and I feel like should have their own book. Most of them don't. But the Remonds are two, I think, who are calling for further investigation, and their papers are at their family papers, extensive family papers, are at the Peabody Essex Museum. Another person right here, Robert Morris. So when the crafts are in Boston, they have all these different allies, both white activists and Black activists. It's the Black activists who really put their lives on the line, and they are not fully credited. There's one, William Cooper Nell, who was he was running around everywhere behind the scenes, helping everyone. He actually chronicles other people's stories. He's a historian, but there is not much of a paper trail for him. And there's this one letter he's writing to this activist named Amy Post in Rochester, and he's saying, the crafts case is so exciting, I could fill a book with everything that I've seen and experienced here. but I don't have time. And it's one of those times that a researcher, you're like, oh my gosh, I wish you could just take 5 minutes. His image is right here, but Robert Morris above him was also born and raised in Salem, and he was one of the first black attorneys in this nation, and how he came to be this way, or have and pass on this legal legacy, I think is pretty interesting. When he was about 13 years old, he was waiting tables here, and Ellis Gray Loring, who was a lawyer and activist from Boston, encounters him at this restaurant, and he's so impressed with this young man that he wants to employ him, and he talks to Robert Morris's mother and makes an arrangement for Robert Morris to come and work for him. Originally it's in his house, but then eventually Morris ends up working in his law office and then becomes one of the first, the second, I think, black attorney in our nation's history. Then when this Robert Morris is a lawyer, soon after the Crafts come to Boston, there's another young boy who's fresh off the boat from Ireland, and he's not orphaned, but he's fatherless. He's getting beat up in the Boston schools. He's having a really hard time. He's facing discrimination as an Irish immigrant, and Robert Morris sees him when he's a young man, a boy also, recognizes that there's something special in this kid, mentors him as he had been mentored, and this boy grows up to become the mayor of Boston. This is Patrick Collins. And actually, I have a kid who ended up doing some research on this, and the legacy continues. So what we give in this way can be passed down. Anyhow, that's a long tangent about Morris, who starts off in Salem, part of this amazing community, and there are many others.
It's a great story. Well, I wondered if we could shift to talking about craft. So you mentioned all the footnotes, right? There are a ton of footnotes. You've done a lot of research, right? Research into primary sources, not just secondary sources. And so I wondered if you could talk a bit about how, given that you researched it so thoroughly, it reads like a novel, right? Like, so how did you do that? That's hard to do, right? I guess, yeah, maybe if you could walk us through, an example maybe. So I'm kind of thinking about when the Crafts are on the ship, going from Canada to Liverpool, and you tell us about the gales and about the seasickness and, the conditions in steerage. Like, where do you get all those details, right, that make it feel like you're actually there when you're reading it?
Yeah, so I went into kind of like a method acting mode, like just really trying I didn't actually go on a steamship or a steerage ship, but I wanted to get like the texture and the feeling of being right there on the ship. So I went into a deep dive. The American Antiquarian Society has all these steamship records. This is one thing, like railroad people and steamship people are super obsessive and super organized. They keep meticulous records, so you can get like everything. You can get like diagrams, you can get like menus, you can get all kinds of different things. I knew the name of the ship, and all the other accounts I had read said they went on this steamship called the Cambria, and that's pretty much all I had. But I could find the Cambria. I could find a diagram for the Cambria. I could find, when I was in England actually, I found a newspaper clipping that showed their names, like the registration of their names aboard this ship. So I had the date, I had the captain's name, and this is the part that really blew my mind in England. So on top of all this, like, if you've read the book, you know that by the time they're on the steamship, they're just like, they've made it through hell. Like everything on that first leg of the journey from Macon to the north, it seemed to happen sort of magically. All the horrible things that can go wrong in travel in this period, it's like they were able to sail through. It almost felt like there was something watching over them. It's like the opposite experience. So they're like barely onto the steamship Cambria, and I've sort of been following them, like slogging through just like everything. They're literally up to their knees in mud, like walking through the last 7 miles of this. when they do finally end up on the ship, it turns out, I found in this newspaper record, there was a gale storm. So on top of like everything, they are sick, they're ravaged, they've had to like spend weeks in Canada, and now they're on this thing. I'm like, oh, a gale storm. What does it feel like to be on a gale storm? And then I started reading accounts of what actually, like there were people who would, I kind of considered them my like sometimes unstable camera people, like who have these alternative points of view, like these travelers who are, it's kind of like they're taking selfies, you know, as they're going along, but it's like in print, and they're writing about all these things that they've seen, what the food is like. I mean, I got to, you know, read about the dishes of like pickles and all kinds of like, actually yummy things that they had aboard when they weren't all getting sick, because it was, you know, the ship is going like up and down, and then how things go flying, and really people thought they were going to die when this gale storm was going on. So I did amass like a ton. I think I probably could have written 50 pages on the gale storm. But then of course, who's going to want to read 50 pages about the gale storm? So weaving that together, that was the challenge. And I think what really helped was just try to think about it cinematically. So I was also studying screenwriting because, I mean, talk about muscular, just really economical writing. Screenwriting has to do that because it's not like you've got hours to burn. And so I really sort of tried to picture it with a camera and sort of screenwriting notes and beats in mind. And that's sort of what made it possible for me weeping as I got rid of all those details that I had lovingly amassed, like what made it possible for me to cut some of those out.
So can you speak a bit about some books that inspired you as you read that, as you were writing? And I will say, you know, I'm writing, but as I was writing, you know, I was reading this, and you know, you inspired me to, I guess, my first thought was, oh, what I've written is terrible. You know, I just wanted to read it because it doesn't read like this. But like, what were you reading as you were writing?
I was reading a lot because I think one thing I did neglect to mention, and I love hearing you say that it felt resonant and that it felt novelistic, because I'm still scarred, not just by Giles Corey, but by my editor, who told me, like, after I sent in my first draft, that it was really, really bad. She said, actually this is perfect for Salem. She called my writing a scholarly tomb.
That is a compliment.
She said, like, I had basically taken everything that was like exciting and active about the story and choked it to death. So this is because the research really overwhelmed everything, you know. And that's really where I started frantically looking for writers who had written forward before. And I wasn't looking at history, because I knew history gets me in trouble, because that's when I get weighed down, and I would save that for the footnotes. But I started looking especially at novelists. I was looking at movies and novels. And one big one was Colson Whitehead's Underground Railroad. I was amazed at how fast he's able to move. And if you've read that novel, if you go back over to the first chapter, it's called Ajari, but it's about an ancestor of Cora's, the main characters, and how and it tells her story, her entire life story, and a whole world, like history, in, I think it's like 3 pages. It's amazing how fast it is, how fast he flies us through a whole world, within paragraphs, within lines. And I thought, like, all right, I've got to find a way to do that. And he has a chorus of so many different voices, and that's something that I wanted too. So I borrowed him. All the Light We Cannot See, All the Light We Cannot See? Yes, Anthony Doerr's book. That's another book that kept me turning the pages, and the writing was so beautiful. And I thought, how does he do that? And one of the first things I noticed is that the chapters are really short. So they're really dense and they're really beautiful, but they really move and they're really short. So if you'll notice, I have very, very short chapters, and I wanted each one to have what my daughter would call at the time a hanger cliff. Something that makes you feel like you're hanging off a cliff with each one. Each one has a question that the next chapter has to answer. And those are the building blocks of suspense, those questions. So I tried to follow that form and weave in the history and thereby make the story move.
Well, you do it beautifully. So I imagine most of you have read the book, but if anyone hasn't, I highly, highly recommend it. It's such a pleasure to read. So thank you for the gift of this book. And why don't we open up?
Yes, I think we want to open it up to audience questions. I also want to be respectful of everybody's time. So I'm going to suggest, know that Elizabeth and Ilyon are going to be out in the lobby. So if you brought books with you, you can have your books signed. You can ask any questions that are not answered in the next few minutes. So I am going to ask for 3 questions. I'm going to take 3 questions, and then I'm going to thank everybody, including our sponsors, and wrap it up. And I can't see with these lights in my eyes, so let me step out. I'm afraid of the microphone, so if you can just ask your questions really loudly. Former public school teacher, I can make loud noises. Oh, here comes Anderson, who's going to help us out with the... First question comes from this lady over here. I'm sorry, I can't actually see if you're later. There's a person right next to you. Hi.
I wanted to ask you about the way you had to write around Ellen, right? You don't have a lot of, based on your notes, your historical sources, you don't have a lot written in Ellen's voice, and yet clearly wanted to have Ellen speak in the book. So how did you overcome that little gap in source materials to bring Ellen to life and have her speak how to point you in your book?
Thank you for that question. Representing Ellen. So how do you represent Ellen's voice? How do you represent her character when there is little source material that she leaves behind? That really was a central question because she does tend to get erased, right? Both Williams are sort of talking over her, and there are various theories as to why. Some scholars have postulated that the Williams silenced her. I have a slightly different take on it, that might have been something that she chose. But how do I come to these conclusions? Well, one of the things is looking at different kinds of sources. I think when you look at histories that have not typically been told in the mainstream histories for which there are few source materials, you have to sort of expand your idea. We have to expand our idea of what an archive is. So you're looking at other kinds of sources, whether it's like textiles or evidence from material culture, or you're looking sideways at existing materials that, let's say, the enslavers kept. In Ellen's case, I had to do a lot of really careful eavesdropping because there were a lot of people who were watching her and who were recording things that she was saying. So even if she wasn't saying these things, I could sort of listen in through the correspondence. So an example that I'll give is when she's in England, there's no record. I mean, I wish there was some kind of diary from her, right? Wouldn't that be amazing, where she expresses her feeling? But there are these British activists who are watching her, who she's living in their home, and they adore her, the Estlins. And one woman she watches Ellen when Ellen does not know that she's being watched, and Ellen is sweeping or working, and she's reporting on hearing Ellen sing to herself as she's working, and she gives the line from the song, and I thought, I wonder what that song might be. I have this line from this letter in the Boston Public Library, and I look it up in the abolitionist songbook that William Wells Brown had published, and you can find also online. And I found the line in a song called The Fugitive's Triumph. And when you look at the whole stanza and what she's singing and what the words that are coming through her mouth and the song that she's singing to herself, you get a picture, like a little soundbite of her. And I call the whole chapter fugitives triumph, because that's really what is happening in that moment. And another line that I love that sort of is, again, overheard is when she's in England, she's walking through these big drawing rooms, and she's seeing these places beyond anyone's imagining in Macon. She's heard to say again and again, "Oh, if only my old mistress could see me now."
All right, how about the center of the audience here? Who we got anybody?
I have a question about your writing technique. So you were saying that you had like a massive amount of research, and then your editor called it like a literary tomb.
Scholarly tomb, yes.
I'm sorry. But I was wondering kind of how you took all of your research and then you kind of picked and chose what you wanted to say to kind of make it on just like a really interesting story that on like the readers are kind of want to read it and they're really like enraptured and stuff.
Thank you. I love that, enraptured. So how do you go from that scholarly tomb full of all sorts of great stuff that scholars love, but that not everybody wants to see, right? I mean, basically I was like a hoarder, and I had to sort of choose what is it that how I'm going to tell the story. And for me, the way I did it was I kind of, when I actually wrote through, like when I started writing the action of the chapter, I didn't let myself look at the notes. So I had all these notes, and I had done it that way before actually. Like I had hundreds of pages of timelines. So like, for example, in the whole Boston section, there's so much happening each hour, each moment of every day. So I had this massive chart where I had like, sometimes by the hour, like down on one column, and then I had all the different characters and what was going on. It was so cool to be able to see it for me. But then when I wrote that, and I was like, all right, and this happened, and that happened, and then this happened, my editor, the one who said scholarly tomb, she said this, she's like, this, that, they do this, they do that. She's like, I don't want this, that. I want like the action, the through line. So again, I had to throw out that whole chart, and I was like, okay, I cannot look at the chart. I've done the chart, I've done the homework. Now I'm just gonna go as if I'm telling you the story. I'm gonna try to remember it and not cheat and not look at all those things. And whatever it is that comes to mind, that's the important part. And then later I cheated a little bit and got by that time, some of it helps and some of it doesn't, but yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, and how about on hand right in the middle there? The gentleman next to, is that you, Owen?
It is me.
Oh, okay.
Thank you so much for this book. It is remarkable, as you know. I also want to thank the Athenaeum for choosing the book for their two
President of the board of the Salem Lit.
It should be noted that they chose it months before it actually was awarded the Pulitzer-Prize, and it's really quite competitive. I think we have a history in this country of not remembering stories that don't end the way we come to. And I felt that, when they crossed the border into Canada, I said, oh boy, it's going to be lollipops and unicorns and rainbows from here on out. And then never thought, just memories. They get slapped again and again and again. You have rumors and lies, illness and night raiders and all these things that affect their lives forever. And I think that's why a story like this kind of gets lost, to history. Thank you so much for looking up their story and sort of adding flesh to the bones of the story that they are written. It's really quite remarkable. I have a really sort of practical question to ask. I can never understand how they made money with these tours. I mean, to us in the 20th and 21st century, the thought of going to a hall to listen to somebody telling their story, it's just something I just can't relate to, And obviously they didn't have radio, video games, other things to occupy themselves. But can we give us some sense of how much money they would, when they go to Faneuil Hall, and there'd be hundreds and hundreds, how much money would they actually walk out of there with? That was their only income, right?
Well, no, actually, yes and no. They were raising money for the abolitionist cause, and so there are these coffers that were going around, and we don't have precise numbers, but they weren't making a lot of money off of their lecturing. They might be, their travel was getting covered and such, But fortunately for them, they had other great skills, marketable skills. So William was a cabinet maker. He couldn't actually make a living as a cabinet maker in New England, but he did sort of reupholster, reconstituting furniture. He had his own shop. Ellen was learning upholstery. She was a seamstress. She made, beautiful dresses as well. So that's really where they made more of their money. But thank you for the question about remembering. And I have maybe one last story that I can sort of share with you. I've been thinking about this for a while. I was thinking about this picture from the January 6th insurrection. I mean, just thinking about the stories that we choose to remember. And there's a man with a Civil War flag, and he's in the Capitol. And the reason why I was thinking about this is because if you look at the image again, you'll see that there are two paintings on either side of him. He's framed right in the middle. And the picture to him on the left is a picture of John C. Calhoun. And the picture to him on the right is Charles Sumner. So when I first saw this image, I was like, oh my gosh, this is all about the crafts. And I told my husband who was sitting here, and he's very patient and very gentle. He's like, sweetie, everything for you is always all about the crafts. Which is very true, but in this case I was like, no, but really, these people were in the craft story. And because Calhoun, looking very cadaverous in this image, was beloved by Ellen's father and represents his voice in the South. And then there's Charles Sumner. And so anyway, I wrote this whole op-ed. The Boston Globe was like, eh. Luckily, Clint Smith actually wrote a piece analyzing those images for The Atlantic. So I urge you to look at that. But one thing that Clint Smith's piece, he went on a different angle than I did. One thing that I did add in looking at this, because I was looking at it through the lens of the craft story, is when you look at that picture of Charles Sumner. So Charles Sumner is now known for having this, violent caning incident. That's sort of what he's best known for. But in this very time period where the crafts were coming through Boston, he and Robert Morris, who I mentioned before, who had these roots in Salem, were fighting this case on behalf of Sarah Roberts, a little girl who had to walk past several white schools in order to get to the one school available to black children in Boston. She loses the case, they lose the case. But generations later, the arguments behind this case are used for Brown versus the Board of Education. And when I wrote this article, what I wrote was Brown versus Board of Education. The decision that was made there laid the way for another little girl, not Sarah Roberts, but another little girl who became Vice President of the United States. So the work that people were laying, the ground that they were laying in and around 1850, right? Charles Sumner and Robert Morris failed in that case. And there were a lot other more failures at that time. But the impact of that work, the legacy, still endures to this day.
I feel like we could go on for a while, and again, we have an opportunity to continue the conversation out there. I would like to thank the fabulous Ilyon Woo. Thank you so much. Dr. Herbin Triant, who was kind enough to provide, represent all of us in interviewing Ilyon. Representative Manny Cruz, who joined us today to introduce the talk. And bear with me, because a lot of organizations and individuals in Salem help keep this literary festival free. So if we could thank the producer, the Salem Athenaeum, the Salem Public Library, Salem Cultural Council, Wicked Good Books, please buy books out in the lobby, the House of the Seven Gables, Salem Maritime National Historic Site, Essex National Heritage, Theater in the Open, Leonardo Audio, Molecule Literary Magazine, the Salem Five, the Salem State University, Salem Academy Charter School, who donated the space today, Peabody Essex Museum, and all of the wonderful readers like yourself who keep festivals like this going. If you haven't already, please check out the Salem Athenaeum. Our whole mission is to create a community for curious thinkers like yourselves. And this is the biggest program we do all year, but we are doing interesting programs like this year round. So please check us out at 337 Essex. And with that being said, we wrap the 15th annual Salem Literary Festival. There are authors and books and snacks out in the lobby. Thank you so much for joining us.